Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Brodo Fantasy Football Podcast, presented by BrodoFantasy.com and the Fantasy Football by Brodo app, the only tool you need to dominate fantasy football.
What up, what up, what up? Welcome back to the Dynasty Don version of the Brodo Fantasy Podcast, where we go Dynasty deep and talk about everything Dynasty. Today, I got my first guest on the podcast, Themi, at Gridiron Greek. You may know him for all of his antics on the social medias. What's up, Themi? How you doing?
What's going on, Matt? It's good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to have you, man. It's always a good time when me and Themi get it kicking. We've done a few crunch times together, and it's always a blast. Today, I mean, we can get right into it. We're going to be covering the NFL Combine, recapping the top scores, kind of going into how you should view athletic grades in your rookie process and when analyzing the prospects that are coming into the 2023 class, and how much these scores really matter and how they affect and translate to points per game, which are the most important things for your fantasy rosters, obviously. First, before we get into anything, I think Tim would be remiss if I didn't touch on a little bit of news and notes. And the biggest and most obvious thing I think that we have to cover is Derek Carr signing a 4-year, $150 million, $100 million guaranteed contract with the New Orleans Saints. Right off the bat, I mean, obviously, I think that was one of the more obvious signings. It's certainly, one of the biggest dominoes that's going to fall this offseason. He was the perfect fit. He'd already been there in positive interviews and whatnot. I think it was just more so when it was going to happen. Saints get themselves an upgrade at quarterback undeniably, but how much of one is still to be seen. How do you feel about it, Themi?
I mean, hey man, you're the Saints fan over here. Just the fact that you're excited about it is really good to hear. I think Derek Carr's a good fit there. They do need a quarterback. I was kind of hoping he would go to the Jets. I think I would love to have seen him live. Maybe I can catch him if he does play in New York. But Chris Olave is going to be the number one wide receiver there. He was last year. It's assumed that Michael Thomas is going to get cut. Alvin Kamara is probably not going to be back on the team. So that leaves him with one big weapon, which is essentially what he had last year. I mean, he had Darren Waller, who was kind of having a down season. But things weren't really working out there. So it's kind of good to see him on a team where that they have the ability to draft a little better. And I'm just kind of excited to see him there. But I'm not like holding out for a phenomenal season for the Saints just because of that. But a good a fit as any. Just was hoping for the Jets there.
I do think that, I think the Jets are probably going to be the number one suitor for Aaron Rodgers this season with some of the draft capital that they have and being just one quarterback away, supposedly, with that roster. I like Carr to the Saints. I mean, I don't like how much money it is, but Mickey Loomis is also a cap genius. Like, there's a reason that he's signing this contract, and he'll work around the other contracts on the roster to be able to be cap compliant by March 15th. But that's just it. As you kind of leaned into it, is Michael Thomas is likely a cap casualty now, as if he wasn't already. It seems almost set in stone now that he must be cut. Otherwise, that $30 million guaranteed kicks in immediately the day after the final cut day on March 16th. Demario Davis and Marshawn Lattimore may even have to restructure. I don't think the defense is really going to see as many casualties, at least big names. Cameron Jordan seems to be one that keeps popping up, but his contract is built in such a way, and he's such a staple of that defense, that it's actually detrimental to their future cap if they cut him at any point of the season or trade him away for that matter. So much of his contract is guaranteed, and rightfully so, as CJ has been one of the best defensive ends in the league. So it seems like the offense is going to take a bit of a hit as far as top names go, in Michael Thomas, potentially Alvin Kamara. They don't have much draft capital. Yeah, they have the back end first from the Broncos, and then can kind of retool in future years with their own picks should they continue to bottom out. But I think signing Derek Carr absolutely puts them in the hunt to win the NFC South, because that division is horrendous, and no Tom Brady makes it even worse. Sure, there may be some quarterback movement elsewhere coming into those teams in the NFC South. Carolina may be looking for a quarterback. Obviously, the Falcons should be looking for a quarterback in Tampa Bay as well now. But it's either going to be rookies or free agents that are lesser talents than Derek Carr. So I think the Saints probably got the best situation out of 4 teams in a poor division that are all vying for new quarterbacks.
Yeah, that
That
makes a lot of
said,
sense.
yeah, I mean, well, that said too, is I think we should just hop right into quarterbacks from the combine and start talking about some of those quarterbacks that those teams might be looking for. I mean, it's obvious. It should be the name on the tip of everyone's tongue, and that's Anthony Richardson. And he had a phenomenal combine. But the question really is, how much do these stats truly matter for quarterback success? Like, we've seen lots of athletic freaks and lots of Konami code quarterbacks, but I think it should be worth noting that a guy like Anthony Richardson was as athletic as he was and tested as good as he did and didn't have a phenomenal collegiate production to back it. Like, there is something to be said about how guys perform on the field, specifically at the quarterback position, because if you look at like historic point per game trajectories and wins above replacement for draft or quarterbacks coming out of the draft and like what affects their draft position the most. Size is certainly one of the things that affect their draft position specifically, but it has very little correlation to their points per game and their wins above replacement. 40 time has a huge correlation to their draft stock, but again, a very minimal correlation to their wins above replacement. And it's everything athletically for quarterbacks has a very minimal correlation. So, yeah, Anthony Richardson had a phenomenal combine, but does it really matter? And athletic grades are important for raising draft stock. And we know that draft stock is important for being able to bucket prospects when you're looking at their production profile attached then to their draft stock. And it can shorten the window and tell you kind of, okay, we've seen this X amount of quarterbacks with over 1,000 rushing yards at this position in college football and being drafted in the top 15. If Anthony Richardson were to fall into that bucket, it would certainly be very positive for his outlook. But the production that he put up in college isn't overly positive for his outlook. And athletic grades are a piece of the puzzle, but a very minimal piece of the puzzle, especially looking at the quarterback position.
Yeah, I do wonder though, because I'm looking at the chart because you shared it with me, and I see what correlates to WAR and what correlates to draft position, and like you said with quarterbacks, draft position, you can see an obvious correlation there, but with WAR you really don't. But I wonder if athletic scores are now sort of starting to increase in terms of things like wins above replacement or even fantasy points, because that's really what we care about at the end of the day. I mean, obviously we want to see our teams succeed, but with players like Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson or Justin Fields, does a 3-cone score or a shuttle score, does that correlate more recently? And obviously, I know you don't have the exact answer for that, but I think it is interesting as we see this quarterback landscape shift year after year. I don't know if these are perfect because nothing really is, but that is something you have to consider when you look at these. But quarterback is the hardest
Well,
position to scout. So I mean, it's always going to be pretty difficult to find something that directly leads to a great quarterback.
exactly. And there's so many outliers of the position and so many guys that obviously and because of the, denominators matter, more quarterbacks are selected in the first round than any other position as well. So you see a higher bust rate for first round quarterbacks. That's going to be the case because denominators matter. But with that said, I want to be very clear in that it, as an overall, like looking at the entire bucket of players, there have been more successful non-athletic quarterbacks than there have been athletic ones. That said, the advantage that rushing quarterbacks give you specifically to your fantasy teams and to your roster, it can never be understated. There's a reason that we call them the Konami code. You don't need to be able to bolster phenomenal passing production when you are that good of an athlete. All of that said, we'll get into the numbers a little later. Certainly, putting scores up like that are going to affect your draft stock, and which will affect your dynasty draft stock and where you're taken in superflex rookie drafts. And Anthony Richardson, for everybody's money, has solidified himself as a first round draft pick, and that will change the landscape of how, even just the trickle down effect of how rookies are valued. If Anthony Richardson was going at the back end of firsts in early mocks or even a little later, and now he's going at the 1, 2, 1, 3, as the best rushing quarterback in the draft, and perhaps he's favored a little less than Stroud or Young still, but going in that range certainly, then you're going to get better value for your later rookie round picks as well. That leading into that, like, running backs are the athletic scores that kind of matter the most when you're projecting their career trajectory. It certainly matters the most for draft stock. 40 times are going to be king. They're if you're fast and hit a high 40 and you have good BMI, like, the NFL is going to love you, especially if the production profile attaches. So guys are always going to be slightly overvalued for their athleticism, but it absolutely correlates at the running back position. So when you're asking yourselves, like, how much do these athletic grades really matter and how much should I invest into my rookie profiles if a guy blows away the combine and I didn't expect him to, a la a Chase Brown? The answer is production is always going to reign supreme, but these scores do matter. But they don't matter in the same way that they're marketed to us. 40 is the most important for affecting draft stock once again, but it seems that agility scores, burst scores, the 10-yard split are much more important stats and analytics for looking at actual production in the NFL. And guys that have kind of what you would consider middling 40 times, but really good verticals or really good broad jumps or great agility, those guys are much more valuable to their teams on field. And obviously, as running back, it's one of the easier positions to kind of predict production from. If they've got a great receiving profile, that usually correlates to NFL receiving as well, but it's athleticism and production. If they check all of those boxes when you're analyzing rookies, that's a very positive thing. You should consider athleticism to be a heavyweighter because draft capital is also one of the biggest indicators for running back success. If you were just to take running backs that were in the first round, ignore everything about their production profile, and just build a historic dynasty team of running backs that were in the first round, you would have an incredible hit rate.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense once you actually start to look at how an NFL game is played. Because, like you said, with running backs, maybe that 40 time isn't super important compared to the 10-yard split. And that's because, well, most running backs aren't running 40 yards at a time. They're trying to get, 5-6 yards. So that initial burst might matter more. The agility scores because, you got defenders coming at you and you got to, make the cuts. You got to have the vision. They maybe matter a little more for how an in-game situation might play out versus, no pads running in a straight line, because how often is a player doing that? Maybe for a returner, that could be a big factor, just, pure speed. But yeah, I think even the average person could figure it out if they just thought about it a little bit. And it's nice to have the stats kind of show that that's really true.
Right, right, and well, I mean that's exactly it. Is correlation doesn't always equal causation, but in this case, it certainly does, and it's kind of one of those, like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Like, are they super productive because they're athletic, or is the athleticism what leads to their production, and vice versa, or does that matter at all? And I think that's exactly it. Is the running backs that have the best production also seemingly have the best athletic scores, which are also going to lead to the best draft capital, which also helps you bucket them into elite over replacement level prospects. So it's not a perfect science, obviously, no, but that's when I guess the difference between these other positions, and I'll highlight it with wide receivers in a second, but that's where running backs kind of get a pass, or at least it's a little bit easier. Is you don't necessarily need everything to be super elite if they have above average production, above average draft capital, and above average athleticism. That's a very, very good prospect to invest in. And obviously, a guy like Bijan Robinson that checks all of those boxes at an elite level is somebody you should consider dynasty gold. And for that matter, wide receivers in concerns to athleticism, this is where it really bothers me, because to be blunt, it doesn't matter. Like, 40 times don't matter for wide receivers. It is the single most important analytic to affecting their draft stock, and the single least important to analyzing how they affect their teams and their points on the field for your fantasy rosters. Like, 40 times just don't matter. And I tweeted it out a while ago, but if you look at, like, the top 12 wide receivers in 40 times, and where they even got drafted, in points per game over the last 10 years, like it's 4.5s across the board. It's 4.5s in Tyreek Hill. Like that, but so much draft stock gets put into John Ross III, Jalen Hyatt. I'll just be, blunt with it. Very limited route trees and incredible speed. And Hyatt kind of disappointed actually with his 40 time, because for the prospect that we wanted him to be, or the draft capital that people were hoping he was going to get, he should have had John Ross numbers, because everything else is slightly a red flag. But athleticism for wide receivers is just, agility is very important. And when you see good three cones, good shuttle times for wide receivers, that generally does translate to a higher point per game. But like, hand size is one of the most correlative things, and people don't care, to look up wide receiver hand size or like post about, guys having 10.3 quarter inch hands. But that's one of the things that correlates the most. It's not 40 times, and it's not vertical leaps. It's nice to see wide receivers with incredible athleticism, but once again, production with wide receivers will always reign supreme. And if you're investing too much into athleticism with wide receiver, you will inevitably always miss out on Keenan Allen, Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams, CeeDee Lamb, AJ Brown, all of them, because none of those guys have overly elite athletic scores in comparison to some of these John Ross types, Henry Ruggs types. And that it's an overly invested metric that has never correlated. It's great when you have a Jamar Chase, but it's not like he didn't also put up the 1,700 yards at 19 years old, right? That's what makes him the great receiver. It's his timing. It's his nuances. It's a chess game between wide receiver and defensive back, and speed is just a small variable. So much of it matters in 10-yard splits. You see really good correlation, deceleration. So things like the three cone. And it's unfortunate, I think, for a lot of dynasty managers that are trying to navigate these waters, because you do see draft capital get dominated by guys that performed really well in the combine. And again, that helps you bucket guys into a smaller category of elite status. But for wide receivers, it should be the last piece of the puzzle that you connect is their athletic scores. Everything else should have to line up first if you're going to invest this top end rookie draft capital in them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at it right now, and the 40 time is like the ultimate this thing for draft position based on this chart. Not necessarily. I mean, it's a small effect, and then you see that the WAR is not really affected. And like you said, guys like John Ross and Henry Ruggs, Calvin Austin, who the Steelers just drafted. They had Tree Archer at one point, and a lot of these guys don't really pan out. They find a small role, but because you need separation. And speed doesn't always equal separation. You need to be able to like make cuts. You need to be able to run a route correctly, because if you just run straight, there's going to be a safety waiting for you. And if that's the only thing that you can do, they're going to catch on pretty damn quickly. So if you allow one touchdown, you're not going to really, keep getting those touchdowns that easily.
Yeah, man. And I mean, that's kind of where college and NFL are obviously such huge levels. And yes, the SEC and SEC defenses and that kind of conference adjusted, when guys are very, very good in that conference is obviously very important and kind of correlates a little bit better, but it's still like the safeties and defensive backs at the NFL level and that are funneled into the 32 teams in the NFL are simply better than any group of defenders any college player has ever faced, like, period. So when you don't possess those nuances of agility, and it is just straight line speed that you're relying upon, it's not going to correlate to points per game on your fantasy rosters. And you do see guys like Jalen Hyatt get overdrafted, and the kid won a Bolitnikov. I mean, he probably should be drafted pretty highly in your rookie drafts. But that said, his red flags are limited, a limited route tree, not the same 40 time that we were hoping for, not incredible burst and athleticism, but good enough, and certainly enough to boost his draft stock to a point that people are going to think he's a better prospect than a guy like Josh Downs, and I just don't think that that's the case. And
I was just about to bring up Josh Downs, by the way. I've got his RAS pulled up right now.
We'll wrap it up with tight ends, and just to continue on, like how much you should invest in these athletic scores, and how you should be kind of trusting your own process in how you should evaluate rookies, or I guess how I evaluate rookies with some success. And tight ends is obviously the hardest one. Otherwise, we would all have predicted all of the Travis Kelce's and people, would have been higher on Pat Fryermuth in his rookie season, sophomore breakout, and things of that nature. But they seem to be unpredictable and certainly late career breakouts in the NFL. Now, athleticism plays a major key to tight end success. But again, it seems as if things like the 10-yard split and vertical, which is explosivity, and broad jump, which is explosivity, are kind of undervalued. And 40 time, again, is overvalued. But look at all the great tight ends, man, like George Kittle, Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, and then the super athletic ones, Mike Gesicki, Noah Fant. Like, there's levels to that position. And I think why you see such late breakouts is because you're everything. Like, you're the fullback, you're a right tackle, a left tackle, a flanker, a Y, a tight end, an inline receiver, right? So it's an incredibly difficult position to produce at, and an incredibly difficult position to develop at. It's why production at the collegiate level is, for the tight end position, isn't as important either. Like, you look at these guys' collegiate production, and they certainly don't pop. Draft capital alone is a huge thing for tight ends. You like tight ends that get drafted early, and you like athletic guys in general. But it's more about the on-field drills for me with tight ends, and really like film grades, which is something that I don't trust entirely in myself. But it's always going to come down to NFL draft capital. Athleticism should separate guys that you have in equal tiers, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't fully buy into the draft capital with the tight ends. I mean, how many first round tight ends are there realistically? Not that many. But like, usually you want like a day two sort of thing. So I do see it from that perspective.
Yes,
But
at
yeah, I mean,
least you
like,
want like second, third round. That's kind of what I meant,
yeah,
is like that's a really good starting point for tight ends.
yeah, that makes. I think speed score correlates really well with success. So you're gonna find a lot of athletic freaks at tight end just because it demands you to be an athletic freak. Like you said, you're asked to do 20 things at once, and once you get to the NFL, if you can't do one of them, you might just be the third tight end on the team and just get
Correct.
nothing. You get no production.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And speaking of like the 2023 class, like, there are some really phenomenal athletes and some uber productive collegiate tight ends coming out, and some guys that are just absolute monsters. But again, I think when valuing the rookies and when analyzing them coming in, you should definitely take into consideration their collegiate draft capital. But yeah, a lot of it is going to come down, or their collegiate production rather, but a lot of it's going to come down to their NFL draft capital. And again, it is greatly affected by their NFL combine, but it's not the greatest correlator. And as you said, one of the greatest correlators is more so, it's not necessarily their straight 40 times or their direct, burst scores and agility scores, but how that correlates to their size. And guys that can really be versatile blockers, runners, route runners. And it's also a position that you have to be incredibly patient for when investing your rookie draft capital. Like, guys are going to want to, maybe not so much anymore. I think he's a major draft faller, but Michael Meyer was a early second round pick, and guys are really excited about him and a future dynasty tight end. But it's gonna take 1, 2, 3 seasons, and you're thinking about passing up on some running backs or some wide receivers that could hit their career peak quicker, but maybe have less elongated career value, especially in tight end premium leagues.
Yeah, I think Trey McBride was going, about 201, 202 in rookie drafts last year.
Facts.
And,
Yep.
you weren't expecting him to pop off, but, if you're a manager who drafted him at the beginning of the second, maybe the end of the first, when you could have had like a wide receiver who put up decent production,
Jahan
you're probably
Dotson, Damian
Jahan
Pierce.
Dotson. Yeah, you're probably kicking yourself a little bit. It's not that it won't pay off, like you said, it just takes a while, and you just have to be willing to wait that out, or maybe just not draft them and try to buy low from a manager who maybe doesn't have that kind of patience, because
That's
your
kind
dynasty
of
league might fold by the time they're actually at their peak. So
absolutely.
make sure your commission is pretty good.
And that's kind of a sneaky strategy, is buying young, undervalued tight ends after they crap out their rookie season or even their sophomore slump, because that's by no means the end of their career arc. If anything, it's just the beginning. A guy like David Njoku, who is highly valued now, Evan Ingram, Dalton Schultz, like all of them, and are all considered, top 10 tight ends. The issue with that position is also that you can flood the NFL with talent, and it's until you land in a good offense. Like, landing spot is very important. When you get an offense that will actually utilize tight ends in the passing game, that's truly what's going to separate. Like, you could be the most talented tight end. Look at George Kittle. He is one, and he has some of the lowest floor games of anybody because he's almost too versatile, and it's not a position that the 49ers utilize consistently in the pass game, especially if they're down an offensive tackle or down somebody on the O-line, where George Kittle is going to have to block a lot more. And that's going to be the case for a lot of these rookies that you're enamored with, is a lot of them are going to turn out to be blocking specialists. And it's not a knack against their talent. It's the position is utilized that way in the NFL by more than the majority of NFL coaches.
Yeah, there's a tight end that really broke out that we'll probably touch on later. I know he's one of your big risers. He's one of the big risers for everyone. But, he's just a massive dude, and there's a lot of massive dudes at tight end. And it's going to be hard to see him immediately find a role as a receiver, no matter where he goes, unless that team really likes to employ like a big tight end attack, like maybe Baltimore, for example. So, a lot of these guys that we get excited for, like you said, it doesn't necessarily translate into fantasy points, but they might be very key for their teams in general, which is, depending on who you support, that might be what matters to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's just time that we get right into the top scores and the actual numbers here, because it was a very impressive combine all around. And we've kind of seen a fast track the last 2 years, but maybe we're just starting to see some incredible athletes truly ascend above. We had 2 perfect 10 relative athletic scores that were one of their classes. So Anthony Richardson at 10.00 and Zach Kuntz, the tight end out of Old Dominion, at 10.00, becoming the most athletic at their position in the history of the NFL Combine, according to Kentley Platts at Math Bomb. Please follow him. Incredible combine analysis from that guy. Quarterbacks, Anthony Richardson topped out basically everywhere. He ran a 4.43 second 40-yard dash. Max Duggan was second with a 4.52 second 40-yard dash. Malik Cunningham from Louisville, 4.53 second 40. Dorian Thompson Robinson from UCLA, 4.56. Clayton Tune from Houston, 4.64. There's really only one name in that list that managers should be enamored with, and it was the guy that was teetering on first-round draft capital in the first place, and that's Anthony Richardson. It's nice to see some athleticism rounded out in this draft class, but I don't think any of those names past AR in the top 5 are going to see significant draft capital or have much more than NFL backup caliber careers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the top quarterbacks are basically set in stone at this point. Even for the big risers, like guys that I like Will Levis and Stetson Bennett, just based on their passing drills. Will Levis is already going to be a top quarterback, but Stetson Bennett, just because he threw some nice passes and maybe had a nice deep ball and whatever, he's still going to be drafted like a backup quarterback. Whereas Anthony Richardson, he was kind of towards the end of that like top quarterback tier, and now he's really like rising just because of that elite athleticism. I think Cam Newton was originally first in RAS, relative athletic score, and then he topped him. There's a lot of great names up there, a lot of guys who had decent careers at least, very high peaks. And I think that's what you could be getting out of Anthony Richardson. And obviously he's the talk of the town. Not a fan of what I saw in the throwing drills very much, but that was never
Agreed.
his like strong suit. A lot of like inconsistencies with the throws, some very high on the outside. Sometimes just like throwing it like a 90 miles per hour into a guy who's like 10 feet away from him.
He likes to whip it. But
yeah,
I think a lot of his issues are somewhat mechanical, and as much of an outlier as he is, and we should probably, NFL GM should learn better, I think, and stop chasing unicorns. But you're looking at Anthony Richardson like a Josh Allen, had a lot of mechanical issues and a lot of accuracy issues in college, but is an absolute tank of a human. AR comes in at 6'4", 220, and can run a flat 4.4. Like, he's the most athletic quarterback in history. There's no way that GMs will not be enamored, and for good reason. If you can fix the small intangible red flags, and I shouldn't say small, but if you can fix the major intangible red flags that almost no quarterback coach has ever been figured out how to fix, except for Brian Daboll that one time, then you have yourselves what is a legit, undeniable, unmatchable athlete and superstar at the position. That alone has always been worth a first round gamble. It is going to continue to be worth a first round gamble because the guy, it's not just, he runs a 4.40, a 1.53 second 10-yard split. That was third of all quarterbacks. The top vertical jump, 40.5 inches. The top broad jump, 10 feet 9 inches. Killed, at least the throwing drills power wise, like showed arm strength, I should say, dominated the arm strength and the pop of the wrist. It was certainly something that was talked, but has some inconsistencies. And again, the other quarterbacks athletically, Stetson Bennett topped everyone in a 20-yard shuttle and looked really good in throwing drills, but he's very small, and size does correlate to draft capital, and he's also very old, and age does correlate to draft capital. And I don't think you're going to see a lot of these quarterbacks at the top of the athletic drills be significant producers at the NFL level. But speaking of draft fallers and risers, I mean, Bryce Young showing up 5'10", 204. Good that he put a little lead weight in his socks so he could get above the 200 mark. But him refusing to throw and run any drills while Anthony Richardson put on the show he did athletically. CJ Young had one of the best throwing combines you'll ever see. Will Levi had an incredibly accurate day as well. It hurts his stock.
I think you called him CJ Young. I think you were combining
CJ Stroud, yeah.
two guys there, and I won't let my Buckeyes be slandered like that. But yeah, if there was a true faller, it would be Bryce Young. I don't think he falls very much. I mean, if he went second overall and first quarterback, I mean, no one would bat an eye. But obviously, not participating in any drills, not throwing, and coming in a little smaller, obviously a bit of a concern. I mean, if he put on a show during the combine, that would definitely help any sort of mini fears that GMs and coaches would have. But I just can't imagine it affecting his draft stock enough. I mean, is the gamble worth it for him? Probably not. I'm sure people advised him to just don't even bother. You're going top 5, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, obviously we've seen several high-end prospects at the quarterback position refuse to participate in drills and kind of just come for medicals and interviews. It happens all the time, and it rarely decimates their draft stock to a point of no return, so to speak. But I will say that the performance of his peers undeniably hurt him when the tiers were already considered so close. Like Will Levi's well before the combine, regardless of what the dynasty community wants to admit, and Anthony Richardson as well, although people were obviously much higher on him for the rushing and athleticism. But both of those guys were in the rumor mill as first round prospects and potentially, one GM or two GM's favorite quarterback prospect in the class. So when the tiers are that close and you see these guys kind of attempt at least to separate themselves, show some competitive drive, and perform very, very well, it undeniably puts Bryce Young in a category where, no, he may not be the first quarterback off the board. Now, I don't think it's unlikely to see, like you said. I don't think we would be surprised if he still was. But I also don't think you should be surprised if any of those other ones are.
Yeah, there's a lot of quarterback needy teams all in a row. I mean, just the top 15. I mean, probably 10 of those teams need a quarterback. If you're at the front half of the draft, you usually need one. And a couple of teams have extra picks, like the Lions. So they may want to trade up, or they might just wait and take one of the 4 guys there. But if one team likes a guy a little more, no big deal.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're going to see pretty similar career trajectories from Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, specifically Anthony Richardson. If some of those mechanics can get fixed and those accuracy issues do not translate to the NFL, which I'm not entirely convinced that they won't, then he could have the highest ceiling of anybody in this draft class and potentially anybody in the NFL. Like, you really are talking about a Lamar Jackson-esque trajectory if the passing lines up with the athleticism. Since we were kind of already talking about him and I want to hop right into it, I'm going to do the quick switch to tight ends. Darnell Washington is by far my biggest draft riser. I get enamored with these big boy tight ends, man. He came in 6'7", 264, actually a little under the 6'8", 280 that he was listed at Georgia. That's fine, whatever. He certainly ran fast enough, jumped high enough, looked great in blocking drills. By far the best blocking tight end in the class. PFF grades would agree. The combine film would agree. How are you feeling about Darnell Washington, man? Because he also made a really beautiful one-handed grab that isn't actually a catch, but in college rules it is. So I'm going to let it pass.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could hear them saying, like, all you have to do is catch it. Like, don't worry about out of bounds and all that stuff, because that's also, the quarterback's in the drill too, so not necessarily that big of an issue. But yeah, I actually did hear some people talking about his blocking drill where he was just pushing that thing along, and they were saying that like his footwork was like not textbook. But when you're that big, it's going to be hard to be a perfect blocker every single time. And if the grades that you trust are saying that he's a great blocker, then you got to trust that. The dude is insane. I mean, even when he looks like he's not doing anything right, he still does everything like amazingly. Like, he's this big lumbering dude. He'll just catch anything in his radius. He was perfect on the catching drill, on where he's like turning around catching those. And he didn't look like insanely perfect, but it's like he's just so gifted and so talented, and you can tell like he puts in the work too. That it really doesn't matter if his form isn't perfect. It might affect him sometimes. Maybe in terms of blocking, it's going to take some getting used to with NFL defenders. But coming from Georgia and blocking for that team in the SEC and all that stuff.
Yeah, no doubt though.
Yeah.
Like, iron sharpens iron. The guys that he was facing are all like blocking against in practice are all consistently top 15 NFL draft prospects. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. And like, he's just a massive human. He topped everyone in the 20-yard shuttle. So he's agile as well. Like, he moves way better than his size would indicate he does. 4.64 second 40-yard dash, top 6 in the 10-yard split. 21 reps on the bench, which was 4th overall. I mean, yeah, he's somebody that undeniably rose his draft stock when there were a lot of questions about his collegiate production because he was kind of stuck on the same roster, stuck for a lack of a better term, as Brock Bowers, who is next year when we get to the same episode is going to be one of the best tight end prospects that the NFL has ever seen. That said, the guy that really stood out, Zach Kuntz. I mean, obviously topped in the broad jump, topped in the vertical jump, top 3 in the 10-yard split, 2nd overall in the 40, 4.55 40, 1.5 second yard 10-yard split, a 40-inch vertical. Like, and the guy is also 6'7" and 260. He is absolutely massive. And a really productive collegiate career, but also Old Dominion, so a lesser conference, lesser school. No disrespect at all, but it is just a lesser level of competition. There's not a very high hit rate for players to come out of that school. That said, he ranks first out of 1,020 tight end prospects from 87 to 2023. First, he's the most athletic tight end we've ever seen. Jelani Woods, take a step back. I really liked Zach Kuntz as a sleeper. I don't think he's a sleeper anymore. I think he's going to be one of the higher drafted tight ends in this draft class.
Yeah, I think if there was anyone who saw like a meteoric rise in draft capital, it had to be him. Because everyone else, Darnell Washington. Yeah, Darnell Washington was already a great tight end. We knew that, and a lot of people were ranking him very highly. Same thing with Anthony Richardson. He was one of the top tight ends coming into this draft class. Zach Kuntz, I don't know a lot of people who were putting him very highly in this class. I believe he was the former top prospect at tight end, like heading into college, like for high school. And I heard that he barely blocked.
Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't block.
Committed to Penn State, transferred out to Old Dominion. It's kind of hard to play at Penn State when you're behind Patty F. But yeah, and funny enough is they had the top 3. This is just a random story, but they had the top 3 recruits committed to them at one point, and Pat Fryermuth, Kyle Pitts, and Zach Kuntz. And Kuntz was the top out of those three, like one overall in the recruiting class. And then they asked Kyle Pitts to switch to defensive end, and he decommitted and committed to Florida. They kept Pat Fryermuth. Zach Kuntz transferred to Old Dominion. So, I mean, if that's kind of the lineage of tight ends that you're working with, I feel pretty good about Zach Kuntz, and I think NFL scouts do as well, especially after that performance. Draft faller, I think it's obviously Michael Mayer. I'll let you kind of take that one, man. It was horrendous in every aspect, and he was undeniably the favorite to be the first tight end selected.
You know, I feel like I'm the one person who's not reacting as badly to it. I feel like he was like decent enough at everything that he's actually like still a top tight end, just because you want him to do everything pretty well. But yeah, he definitely underwhelmed in a lot of aspects. But I think I'm a little less like, like panic mode about him versus you at least. I mean, yeah, you calling him like a disaster is like, to me, that's like, oh my God, what disrespect.
I mean, it was pretty bad. He had a couple drops in the gauntlet as well, which you don't like to see.
Okay.
But more so, we do kind of, I should feel pertinent that we should revert back to what we were talking about with how you should value these athletic scores, and versatility is very important. And he didn't bottom out in everything. He was just very average across the board. And to see guys that have kind of similar, draft capital projections, Sam Laporta performed very, very well. Zach Kuntz performed very, very well. Darnell Washington very well, and him performing the way that he did and not really being a major standout in anything, it's certainly affecting his draft capital. It's certainly going to affect his dynasty value. And I don't think that managers should have him locked as the number one tight end in career trajectory either. I think it's very, very possible that we see a team get enamored with one of those other names I just mentioned and actually put them in a position to succeed. Where if you see a Michael Mayer kind of be put in an Isaiah Likely situation where he was a phenomenal analytic prospect, but is just stuck behind Mark Andrews, and you're not going to see valuable fantasy production from a tight end too. That's just not the case. You won't, not unless he gets injured. And when he got injured, Likely had some decent weeks, right? But it's utilizing two tight ends in the NFL is good success for running offenses, but it's not going to translate to fantasy success consistently. And if Mayer gets in that position where he's more of a second round pick and more of a project player, I think it's a waste of a dynasty pick, when what you're really attaching to his value now is certainly that collegiate profile, the collegiate production over the athleticism, over what we kind of think about his draft capital and where he's projected to land probably after this combine.
That's a fair point. I will just say that this tight end class is like really, really exciting. So
Facts.
looking at things relatively, yeah, he's not like there's a lot of great scores in this class, like outside of Kuntz and Washington's, like Schoonmaker and all those guys. So Michael Mayer, like outside of this class, he'd probably still perform quite well. But yes, there are a little bit of concerns. Yeah,
that's absolutely a good point too. Is part of the reason that we're kind of I'm kind of discounting what he has done in his collegiate career is the fact that everybody else, like it's when you have the wave rising and you're not rising with it, you're going to be pushed down the tier. So on to the other group of pass catchers, because the wide receivers, to me, their on-field drills were the most exciting out of any of the groups, but the athleticism certainly didn't match where we perceived, and certainly not as previous years. Like the wide receivers of 2022 had such phenomenal combines. Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jahan Dotson, they all performed very well. Treylon Burks, obviously a bit of a draft faller last year, which I think Quentin Johnson kind of takes his place this year for that big-bodied wide receiver that didn't quite live up to the hype. That said, like I really, really liked quite a few of these wide receivers and felt like it was pretty deep, a pretty deep class, maybe not necessarily as deep as 2022, but that it was getting overlooked as a weaker class for sure. I think that those people overlooking it as a weaker class may have been correct. JSN separates himself as the pack, doing absolutely everything better than everyone else except for running the 40. And why would he at that level? Like, why would I let you know that I only have top 4.6 speed when I'm literally the best player on the field? So I think that's a smart business move for him. He's my biggest riser as well, because I think he just separates himself completely from everybody else. Whereas there were maybe a few guys talked about to get top 20, top 25 draft capital. He seems to be the only one that is absolutely solidified to do so now.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really excited for these wide receivers too. And the class, like, not a great showing at the combine. Production wise from college, maybe, you look at that more, and that might, lead you to say that this is still a great class, which it could be. But yeah, JSN, like, he also lucked out that a lot of people just like didn't do well during the combine. But yeah, the one thing was the speed, and him
Well,
not
come
doing
prepared.
that. Yeah, why bother exactly? So I mean, a good bit of luck and preparation there. Um, I know another guy that people are very big on, especially Zay Flowers, pretty big riser from this. Uh, he was like very consistent. Another player who kind of just stood out because everyone else kind of bottomed out. Um, I also like Josh Downs a bit. The only issue I have with him is his like athletic profile is great, and he did very well in a lot of these drills. Um, his 40 times like a bit slow for what people were kind of
Especially for size.
expecting. Yeah,
Yeah.
because he's like he came in at 5'9", 171, which is like tiny. Like Devontae
Marquise
Smith was like
Brown.
181, I think. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
Marquise Brown. There you go. I was like trying to look at everyone. I was like Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle. Like, who else is this small
Marquise
that
is a little
actually like?
thicker too, like 185, but yeah.
Yeah. But the 10-yard split, 1.49 is great for him. The only issue I have with Josh Downs, like to not like fully commit on him, is this is not against like blockers. There's no or like defenders. There's no one he has to like try to like battle against. And I feel like even in this modern NFL where smaller wide receivers can find success, uh, I don't think that these drills do enough to like quell my fears that maybe like he's still a bit too undersized even for
Yep.
a game where you can be kind of small. But he's like middle of the pack for me right there. Like he's not a faller or a riser, but he did just good enough to not like sink his capital. He'll probably rise a bit.
And kind of to touch on the previous statements of production reigns king over everything, especially for wide receivers, and these athletic scores are going to get impact draft capital in ways that they shouldn't. The top scorers in 40-yard dash: Trey Palmer, Nebraska; Darius Davis, TCU; Matt Landers, Arkansas; Bryce Ford, Wheaton; Marvin Mims Jr. Those are the top 5 40-yard dash. Other than Marvin Mims, who again is probably more of a flex caliber receiver on your fantasy rosters and career trajectory, none of those guys are going to be NFL relevant and fantasy relevant wide receivers. Maybe long shot outliers, but literally none of them. And none of them have the production profile of these top guys like Quentin Johnson, JSN, Jordan Addison. None of them. 10-yard splits comes down to Darius Davis, Trey Tucker, Tank Dell, Rashee Rice, Josh Downs. Tank Dell, a major faller for coming in and saying he's going to run absolutely blazing, quote unquote, and then having a 1.49 second 10-yard split and a 4.5 40. Yeah, not great, Tank. Vertical jump: Bryce Ford, Wheaton; Rashee Rice. Quentin Johnson has some good burst in this combine. Refused to run his 40, didn't look great in on-field drills, and came in 15 pounds lighter and an inch shorter than he was listed at TCU. That's obviously a little disappointing for somebody that we were told was going to be an athletic freak. But vertical jump, he comes in at 40.5, pretty decent. This is where Jalen Hyatt kind of started to shine too in the explosivity drills. But again, all of the top scores until you get to 3-cone and 20-yard shuttle, which are agility scores, all of them irrelevant collegiate producers, every single one of them. Yet it's going to greatly affect their draft stock and greatly affect the way that the common player perceives how they should value these players coming into the NFL. Because you want your world's greatest athletes to be world greatest athletes, but it simply does not translate at the wide receiver position.
Yeah, and I mean, from what I'm seeing, vertical has a bit of a bit to do with production in the NFL. But when you look at the bottom, Kayshon Boutte, 29. Now that's booty right there. Like 29 is not a good height right there.
And
Jordan Addison had a terrible one.
Yep.
JSN did, not too great, but he has at least like elite production to kind of cover that up and like good in everything else. Um, but yeah, I mean, a lot of these drills, like you see the guys at the top, and if it's not like JSN, like these guys aren't getting drafted. Um, a bit of like a concern for
Facts.
a lot of players in this class.
Yeah. Well, and then Kayshawn enters the draft with a levy of baggage. He's got concerns about statistical regression, dedication to the game throughout college, and I think they were upheld. He had a pretty despicable showing at the combine, bottomed out in the 40, bottomed out in the vertical, and he's obviously a major draft faller for myself included. For those that was hoping he could still maintain some second round draft capital, and we could ignore a bit of the red flags with his production profile because he had such a great freshman breakout. Jordan Addison, another faller to me, but not majorly. Addison's still going to get first round draft capital. He's a Bolitnikov Award winner at 20 years old. He's had one of the greatest collegiate seasons ever when he was at Pitt. Amongst the top performers in on field drills, which I think silences a lot of the athletic concerns around him because during the gauntlet, they were like, it just was like, oh, he's still Jordan Addison. Like, okay, he just isn't blazing speed, even though he's only 170 pounds. Again, Shirley is still first round pick, but clear behind JSN. And I think the same can be said about Quentin Johnson. Probably still a first round pick. Yeah. Jalen Hyatt may be a first round pick still, but both of them absolutely fall a major tier below Jackson Smith and Jingba. Johnson's explosivity was nice to see, but on-field testing, again, wasn't that great. Jalen Hyatt, touted for incredible top-end speed and acceleration. Very limited route tree, was a red flag. It showed up at the combine again in on-field drills. And we were willing to ignore that with Jalen Hyatt if his speed and explosivity were basically the tops in the class, and they weren't. He simply didn't perform towards the hype that was anticipated for him. He did well, like he was still top, 15 in most categories, every category really, but didn't separate himself athletically the way that he did in college. And it's just disappointing all around, I think, for this draft class. It's still phenomenally productive. You're still going to get very good fantasy assets, but JSN kind of proved that it's top heavy and then everybody else is in a similar tier.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the Jalen Hyatt hype was a bit like not disrespectful. It was a bit too much. I
It
think
was
he
too
did
much.
very well. If you were to look at him and not see the name, you would say, "Wow, this guy did great at the combine." Obviously the size a bit of a concern. He's 6 feet tall and 176 pounds. Um, that's a bit. But you see the 40-yard dash time, you see the 10-yard split. Everything's like super elite. The vertical's high, the broad jump is high. Um, I do think he had like lofty expectations, but when it comes to like what you saw in college, like you said, the limited route tree, it does start to like piece together that like, okay, maybe this doesn't translate into a true NFL like alpha. But I think if you're to take away those expectations, I think he did well enough where you could see how he could become like a contributor in an NFL team.
Yeah.
Just because of his speed, he's got a decent, so if he can put on some weight, that would be great. So I do think the Jalen Hyatt, like, not like I guess like fall a bit too much because of the hype that these people put on him. But I guess if speed is the one thing you have, I guess you might as well do good. Like you said, you might as well be the top. And well, he didn't do that. I think he did good enough.
I don't want people to get angry at me. It's not like
No, I know
4-4
you're not
flat
disrespecting
isn't
him.
like
Yeah.
burning. He's burning. Like it's not, but to not have your most highly touted attribute be better than everybody when that's really the only attribute that's upholding your red flag profile, because he won the Bolitnikov, yeah, but he didn't even contribute at Tennessee before that. Like 26 catches. And
Yeah, and
so
also they're like super fast times like these past 2 years. I think we were discussing that in like DMs and stuff. So if he did like 4.4 in a fast year, it doesn't like show as much like impressiveness. It's not like his fault that like people are testing faster. It's not his fault. Like he can't control that. But
yeah,
like
fair.
when you look at all the classes as a whole, these past two classes as a whole, like it does start to like look a little off for Hyatt over there.
Yeah, and then again, it's not like these things are incredibly correlative to the NFL success, but they are correlative to his draft capital. And when you are going to be at your 1.8 or 1.9 and are staring down the barrel and Jalen Hyatt is the top selection on your ADP board, you want that draft capital to be as high as possible. And the number one thing that was going to drive that draft capital up wasn't the Biletnikoff profile. It was going to be as athletic grades, which again, good. Yeah, I'm not demeaning it by any means. The kid's fast, but he's not the fastest. And that's where it gets like a little disappointing because it's undeniably going to affect his draft stock. Rounding it up and kind of why I left it to the last is running backs because, man, it's one guy, another really good guy, and then everybody else is exactly the same. Like if Bijan came out and he was like, I'll just finish top 5 and everything, look like the best running back in on-field drills, kill all the interviews, already have the greatest production profile since Saquon Barkley, and you guys can figure it out.
Yeah, I think anyone who has created any sort of like prospect model, Bijan Robinson is like number one in like history,
it's perfect.
basically. Yeah,
He's perfect, man.
So I mean,
he's not perfect. There are better overall collegiate, but it's as good as it can possibly get.
yeah, I mean, it's like there's a risk to everything, but if you were to take a gamble on him, it's like you're gonna hit like 90 out of 100 times, maybe more.
Exactly.
That's basically how you got to look at it.
Exactly. 100%, man. 100%. And I do think it's pertinent to kind of hit on some of these other guys because Jahmyr Gibbs came in a little underweight, 199 when he was listed at 204. We obviously wanted to see him break that 200-pound threshold. 5'9". But his receiving profile and his speed, man, Jahmyr Gibbs ran a 4.36, a 1.52 second 10-yard split, second and 40, top 5 and 10-yard split. Like that kid is as fast as it gets and as productive as it gets. He's also coming from the Alabama pipeline, which we know NFL GMs love. He will get the draft capital. If you don't have the opportunity to draft Bijan at 1-1, feel really, really good about wherever Jahmyr Gibbs falls to you. If you're at the 1-4 and quarterbacks go first, or if you can, move back from the 1-2, don't need a quarterback, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to pay off. He is as confident. I am as confident in Jahmyr Gibbs' profile as I am anybody in this draft class that isn't Bijan. Devin Akane came in pretty light as well, but blazed with a 4.32 second 40, has a phenomenal production profile from the SEC at Texas A&M. He's somebody that I think affected his draft stock positively. Again, though, I want to say, other than that is, man, these guys, it's one hell of a draft class. It is very, very good. I think Zach Evans hurt himself by showing up 16 pounds lighter than his listed weight and then refusing to do any drills and just dipping out. Tank Bigsby not really quieting athletic concerns. And Deuce Vaughn being 5'5" and 176. Those are the biggest red flags for NFL draft capital. It will affect their stock. It will affect their dynasty value. Deuce is likely just a gadget player for his entire NFL career and certainly a day 3 prospect when it comes to NFL draft capital. Big risers. Bijan still, if you didn't think he could get drafted top 10, there's a good chance it's going to happen. Obviously, like I said, Jahmyr Gibbs solidified himself as the number 2, arguably pushed himself up into the back end of the first round with teams like Kansas City and Cincinnati staring down potential running back holes as well.
Yeah, and I think there's an underrated guy that you didn't even have on your list that I really liked was Evan Hull from Northwestern.
Good call. Yeah, absolutely.
He performed really well in every single category. He's not like a super great like size for running back, but he's a good receiving back. He got like 55 receptions as a senior there, and he looks really good when he catches the ball. So to see those athletic scores like really really high up. I really like Evan Hull as like a guy who is like kind of lower on draft boards in terms of like running backs. I think he has a type of skill set that you could see translating to NFL production, fantasy production. And I think just like blowing these scores out of the water, that's definitely going to help him at least get draft capital a little higher, which hopefully means that teams will want to use him. In terms of fallers, go ahead.
Oh, I know. Just with Hall, I think he's somebody that can fit into any system as well. So there's not going to be a much of a difficult path for him to get meaningful touches. He might not be the starter right away or even be drafted to ever really be one, but an injury away is all it's going to take for Evan Hall to be able to show that receiving production can certainly translate to the NFL level.
Yeah, and as we're seeing, teams are slowly adapting the idea that you don't need to take the top end, running backs. I mean, Bijan's going to get high draft capital. Jameer Gibbs is going to get high draft capital. But it doesn't matter if you're Isaiah Pacheco and you're going at the end of the draft. If you're good and the team is a good offense, like that's sometimes all it takes.
Mhm.
Situation matters.
Absolutely.
So, if Evan Hull gets drafted to a team where he's going to be like the third running back, then you need two injuries basically, or you need to like outshine some guys. It becomes a little tougher. Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't think draft capital is becoming like as important to find success, at least for like a season or two as an outlier. And if you prove yourself in that season, you might be able to get a contract from another team after your rookie deal expires.
Yeah, that is very important to say too, and it's something that I've kind of touched on in previous podcasts and episodes, but I think the running back position is getting devalued in general by general managers in the NFL. I don't think you're going to see the same draft capital allocated unless there's a Bijan level prospect or a Jameer Gibbs level athlete and receiving versatile production. Because this draft class is also so deep, and yes, I did say it's like Bijan, Jameer, and everybody else, but that's not demeaning everybody else. These are very, very talented guys. 2023 second and third round picks in rookie drafts are going to yield great prospects and great assets for your fantasy rosters. The issue is going to be navigating that. And one of the things that we used to navigate it was draft capital. And as you said, I don't think that same draft capital is going to get allocated. It's kind of like when the same psychology of drafting your fantasy rosters. If you have 5 guys in the same tier, don't break the tier. Profit and take the last guy in the tier. Right? If you think all is equal between guys like Tank Bigsby, Sean Tucker, Zach Evans, so on and so forth, Devin Akane, then take the last guy, the guy that's last on the draft board. Let the other your draft mates kind of set that tier and set the high end value when you can get a very similar hit rate cheaper. And I think you're going to see that in free agency this year with running backs. I think you're inevitably going to see it come draft time. But that doesn't mean that you should demean these talents either. There are going to be a lot more Damian Pierces, a lot more James Robinsons. And that's exactly it, where during their rookie contract or their first 2 seasons, they will return value on your dynasty rosters much higher than the draft picks that you had to use for them.
Yeah, maybe it is good to see these guys fall a little, Matt. Maybe maybe a bad player will well, I mean, they're better than me at everything, but bad player, comparatively, maybe they'll just get a starting role for a season and just kind of, like I don't want to draft Tank Bigsby, but maybe in the 4th round if he's not going to be there, but if he was,
no, he'll be higher than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wasn't a fan of his combine. I wasn't a fan of his like tape beforehand, but
yeah, Tank's somebody that I might have to ignore everything that I know about my prospect profiling just because I like him so much.
He's got a good name for a running back.
Yeah, facts. But yeah, I mean, to kind of wrap that up, does the combine matter? Absolutely. Absolutely it matters. But it is an infinitely small piece of a never-ending puzzle when it comes to prospect profiling. Ultimately, the things that you should weigh the most are draft capital and collegiate production. Athletic scores will lead to higher draft capital, which helps you bucket these guys. But you should, especially if you're in early draft leagues, you shouldn't invest and put a lot of stock into these guys just based off of their athleticism. In fact, the hit rates in doing that would lead to ultimate demise of your dynasty rosters.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these players, like the athleticism, shows when they play. Like especially if they're playing against great talent, which you always want to see. It's obviously harder to do when they're playing, at Old Dominion, where they're not versing, Georgia and Alabama. But usually the most athletic players who are great are going to be at the top. They're going to have the best production and they're going to be drafted higher. So like it's all kind of like a cycle, like you said. Like it's all like a big circle. And yeah, like the combine does matter in a sense, but it's not like the end all be all. And I think people are going to get too enamored with a lot of these players and get very disappointed. Like maybe
Yeah.
Kuntz isn't like the next big thing. Like Jelani Woods didn't have a great season, guys. Oh my God. Like,
Yeah, I'm glad that we kept with the theme of Brodo episodes and ended on something negative. But yeah, don't devalue these players in general, but do devalue how much stock you put into athletic scores. And I think that's kind of the moral of this podcast is athleticism is important, but the best athletes are going to dominate regardless of what the scores say.
I think that's a good way to end that.
Perfect. Well, on that note, make sure you go check out the Brodo Fantasy football Patreon.com/Brodo Fantasy. The podcast you can find Spotify, Apple, everywhere. Follow us on Twitter at PsychWardFF. You can get Themi at Gridiron Greek. For the Brodo Fantasy app, it's at FF by Brodo. For the podcast, it's at Brodo Fantasy. We got at BrodoFFJ, at BrodoFF Casanova, at BrodoFF Tim, at BrodoFF Mike. We got a whole army out here. And please, most importantly, head to the Apple Store, the Google Play Store, download the Fantasy Football by Brodo app for completely free. Get everything that we just talked about here at your fingertips, all the stats, all the information, all the articles, this podcast itself. Subscribe, YouTube. We out here.